What is happening, Packers fans? Welcome to episode 4 of the GOTE, a historical mini-series where we kind of dive into the Packers history, looking in a search for the greatest players of their era. I'm as always, joined by my friend Mark Beech. Mark, how the heck you doing, man?
I'm doing good, Ryan. Thanks. It's good to be here again.
Yeah, it's good to see you, my friend. If you don't know who we are yet, you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow me at Ryan Bowman _PWW. You can follow Mark at Mark Beech 2.0. And we will be joined by our good friend Dusty Evely later on in the show to break down some plays. So looking forward to that as well. And if you haven't watched our previous episodes, in episode 1, we went through the Lambeau era. In episode 2, we went through the 40s and 50s. And then in episode 3, we tackled the legendary Lombardi era. And today we'll be tackling a few different eras. We've got a lot of ground to cover. We're going through the 70s and the 80s, and then we're going to hit up the Ron Wolf era. And I'm sure everybody won't want to miss that part. So without further ado, let's dive right in here, Mark. I'm just going to pop up our little screen here. And as always, if you haven't picked up Mark's book, The People's Team: An Illustrated History of the Green Bay Packers, make sure you guys do that. All the images that we're going through today are from Mark's book. Fantastic read. I've got my copy right here. Make sure you go and get yours. I'm going to throw a link on how to order that up in the chat for all you fine folks joining us today. And just remember, they've got a Kindle version. They've got a hardcover version. I'm a purist, so that's the way I roll. But whatever floats your boat, we'll have it there for you. So without further ado, we've got The People's Team: An Illustrated History of the Green Bay Packers. And just a quick review for any of those who are curious who our previous greatest of their era are. So for the Lambeau era, we've got obviously Curly Lambeau, Don Hudson, and the man, the myth, the legend, Johnny Blood. When we went into the 40s and 50s, we had Don Hudson, Paul Hornung, and Jim Taylor. In the Lambeau era, quite a bit of nominees here this time around. I mean, you can't really argue with that when you've got the legendary team that was. So we had Bart Starr, Herb Adderley, Vince Lombardi, and Ray Nitschke. So that rounded out the Lombardi era. And as we dive in to the 70s and 80s, I think there's no better place to start than Dan Devine. So Mark, maybe tell us a little bit about Dan Devine, who he was, and what his role in Packers history is.
Sure. Well, when he was hired to be their coach, he was the second coach after Lombardi. Lombardi's defensive coordinator, Phil Bengtson, took over the team in '68, and just it wasn't quite working out. The team failed to make the playoffs in any of the seasons that Bengtson was running the show, and so Vince Lombardi had left, and the executive board got rid of Bengtson, who they'd made coach and general manager after Lombardi left, it was a curious move because Lombardi, when he stepped down as coach and became just the GM, he said that both jobs were becoming too big for one man. And as we discussed before last week, the Packers were always best when they were operated by one man running the show. Whether that was Curly Lambeau or Vince Lombardi. And so that the executive board, instead of listening to Lombardi and naming a general manager who was in charge of all football operations, put Bengtson in charge of everything. And when Bengtson flamed out, they hired Dan Devine, and they did the same thing. They made him coach and GM because he was the very successful football coach at Mizzou, but he was also the athletic director there. And so they thought he had administrative experience and could handle it. But that was not really the case. He was an excellent judge of player personnel. He brought in some good players to Green Bay. Not John Hadel. We'll get to that. But he brought some very good players into Green Bay. But he was not a great game coach. His players never respected him. He used to show the Packers game film of his Missouri teams, which the players didn't sit well with them at all. He was kind of standoffish, like just not a warm person. He had an interesting family history, which I think contributed to some of that. But generally, he didn't mix well with Green Bay, and Green Bay didn't mix well with him. And it became poisonous. And like John Hadel, trading for John Hadel was sort of his last desperate act. And that was I think the saying about it was he gave away a 1, a 2, a 3 But he gave away more than that. He gave away 2 1s and 2 2s and a 3. Draft picks, and it decimated the franchise. Whatever good players he brought in, I mean, it was not enough to sort of like cover over. I mean, recovering from that sort of thing in the draft is just nearly impossible. And he was gone. That's interesting though, because Curly Lambeau was from Notre Dame.
I was just going to say, our fearless leader here, Jacob Westendorf, says never hire somebody from Notre Dame, but there is a lot.
Packers colors were blue and yellow because Lambeau was a Notre Dame guy. Like he was.
That's right.
He was in tight with Arch Ward at the Chicago Tribune because Arch Ward was a man of Notre Dame. Like,
and there's a
great scouting network was made up of Notre Dame guys like Frank Thomas at Alabama, who found him Don Hudson. Like, it was and at that time Devine wasn't from Notre Dame. He left the Packers to go to Notre Dame, and
right,
sort of left them in the lurch. And I think he was going to be fired anyway. But it was, it was just not a good mix. And then the Hadel trade sort of like, he was a former MVP, I think, but he was, had been benched by the Rams in 1974, and Devine traded for him. And he was a broken down, older quarterback. I think he was 34 when the Packers got him. And it just didn't work out. And Dan Devine, his fingerprints were on the organization for a long time because of the John Hadel trade.
Now, aside from all the football stuff, there's an interesting mystery maybe surrounding Dan Devine and his dogs and the Fox River. So maybe just give us a little snippet into that story.
Well, Devine, the rumor was Devine, and it was printed in Time magazine, where the only quoted source for the story was Dan Devine, although they quoted anonymous coaches several times. Who knows whether those anonymous coaches were Dan Devine too?
Sure.
But Devine claimed that the things had gotten so ugly for him in Green Bay that the fans had killed one of his dogs. And this was not really true. Like there was Devine let the story linger. He let it sit out there, but as best anyone could tell, it was his dog was raiding a local farmer's farm and killing chickens, and the farmer shot the dog. And in his autobiography that he wrote in about 2000, Devine said, "Hey, you had every right to shoot the dog. There was no problem with that. I understood it." So that didn't make sense to me. Like, why let a story like that linger for so long? But then Devine in the story, in the book, came up with a second dog. He had a second dog that was killed by fans, joyriding at 5:30 in the morning. And I was like, who joyrides at 5:30 in the morning on during a weekday? And it just didn't it didn't make sense. Like, it doesn't really, nothing adds up. So nobody really knows what happened with Devine's dog, but the man, he was an interesting man. He was kind of a quirky man, and he's a complicated fella. How's that?
I was just gonna say he's a complicated fella, and
I don't think that'll make headlines tomorrow. That I said a complicated fella.
Well, hopefully nobody takes it way out of context. But
Devine was, he was a good judge of personnel. He brought in good players. But the Packers won the division in '72 because he brought in MacArthur Lane. He had John Brockington. They were running the ball, and he drafted Chester Markle. And Markle was a good kicker, and they had a great defense that year. But in the playoff game against the Redskins, he took over play calling duties from Bart Starr, who was sort of his quarterback's coach, offensive coordinator in a kind of an unofficial capacity, unofficial official. And it just, things deteriorated from there. It was, they lost that game. They never, really tried to make the Redskins pay for keeping an extra man at the line of scrimmage so the Packers couldn't run the ball. And, it was a disaster. And Devine was at the root of all that.
Well, it can always be worse. All the off-season drama here in Green Bay, nobody's killing Aaron Rodgers' dogs or anything like that. So it could always be worse, folks.
It could always be worse. That's right.
Look on the bright side. All right. So moving on from Dan Devine, we've got Mr. John Brockington here. And, when you and I were looking at this is just an amazing photo. And you had an anecdote about John Brockington in terms of, the pictures that are often floating around of him.
My photo editor disagreed with me about this picture a little bit. She thought it was kind of a muddy image, there's a little bit too much shadow. But it was just, to me, it was stunning. But it was we had a zillion different ones to choose from because John Brockington never took a bad photo on the football field, from what I could tell. I mean, every picture of him is just the look on his face, or the way he, his body, just, this big bodied athlete. He was just an incredible. He was like Jackie Robinson in a way. Like, I never saw a bad picture of Jackie Robinson playing baseball.
Right.
I've never seen a bad picture of John Brockington playing football. He was a wonderful runner for the Packers. He, gained 1,000 yards each of his first 3 seasons. I think at that point, the only player in NFL history to do that.
Yep.
Didn't get along with Dan Devine. He told me about the 72 playoff game against the Redskins. He's told many people that. But he also was like, he went to Ohio State. He played for Woody Hayes. Woody Hayes, like, they would leave the locker room ready to run through a wall, and they thought they could beat anybody in the world. And he said with Devine, like, we'd be in the locker room, and he'd be like, if you guys don't play a perfect game, you probably aren't going to win. And he was like, it was just messed up, man. It was like, it was crazy. That was, I think Brockington was at the tip of the spear of players. Like, he was not a 60s Packer. He was not he was a harbinger of what was to come in the NFL. I think he sat out during the player strike and he contract disputes and he's just a tremendously interesting guy. It's unfortunate he played for some really, really bad Packers teams, except for the one year when they had MacArthur Lane and Chester Muckle together and went to the playoffs. He was like, that was a great team.
Yeah, I mean, it started off good for John, like you said, 3,000-yard seasons. He was the offensive rookie of the year, but like you said, he got kind of hamstrung in terms of the era that and where the Packers were at when he had to join them. So,
That's right.
I mean, but I love this picture. Like, just that intensity on his face is kind of unrivaled. It almost reminds me of, like, those old pictures of Mike Singletary, just that really, really intense look on his face, no matter.
I think just because of the picture quality and then talking to the man, he became one of my favorite players of the era. He was just a tremendous guy.
Awesome. So moving on from John Brockington, we go to the one season wonder in Green Bay, Mr. Ted Hendricks.
Ted Hendricks in 1974, playing for the Packers, blocked an NFL record 7 kicks. He picked off 5 passes. He recovered a fumble. He was traded there on the eve of the season by the Baltimore Colts GM, who Hendricks said the GM thought he was sentencing Hendricks to Siberia. Hendricks says he loved Green Bay. But he had the unfortunate circumstance of only being on a 1-year deal. He was only on a 1-year, he was only in Green Bay for a season and his contract was up. And Bart Starr then negotiated his contract. Devine acquired him, Devine, the great eye for talent. And Hendricks was like, I would have stayed there. I loved Green Bay. But I was looking for something that would take care of me. And they gave me a bunch of contracts which were 1 year and no guarantee to it. And it wasn't the money at all. It was the fact that I got nothing guaranteed. And I was like, I can't sign this. I know I can get guaranteed the money somewhere else. Then I wouldn't have to worry about getting hurt. And so Ted Hendricks left after a season to go play for the Raiders. And of course, he went on to the Hall of Fame. He's a tremendous player. And, if he stayed in Green Bay, he probably would have been an easy choice for the GOAT of the 70s. But he, just 1 year, a tantalizingly great 1 season, just a major force on the defensive unit. And, he's 1 year and gone. And it was too bad. Starr admitted later there was a mistake to let him go. I think it was a portent of things to come with Starr, because one of his failings is he was also made coach and GM. Right. He was a poor personnel man. He passed on Joe Montana twice in the 1978 draft, in the second round and the third round, at which point I think the Packers director of scouting stood up and walked out of the room. He passed on Ronnie Lott in the draft, to take Rich Campbell, the quarterback. Like, he just, didn't go well. They drafted a nose tackle out of Penn State who didn't want to play nose tackle, and the kid left for Canada because playing in Green Bay wasn't so great anyway, and it wasn't such a great place for an African-American. He was like, what do I want to go to Green Bay for? So, Hendricks was a portent of things to come. And, I think it was in the early 80s when the executive committee stripped Starr of the title of GM, but he still had final say over trades and draft picks. So, he was still kind of running the show. It was a bad scene, man.
Well, and it kind of underscores, what we talked about before, where, Starr, one of the all-time GOATs. If there was, a man of Green Bay, it's Bart Starr, and he's one of the all-time greatest players. But when it came
he lived there year-round, he'd been there for 20 years when he became the coach.
Exactly. But when it comes to coaching and some of the organizational decisions, he did not have that same level of talent that we saw on the football field.
He didn't have a great feel for personnel. He was trying to negotiate. I mean, Hendricks is a perfect example. He was trying to negotiate the way Lombardi had negotiated with his players, which was my way or the highway. And as we talked about with John Brockman, like players were different dudes by the 70s. And it just didn't work. I mean, and he was also like, the game management decisions became a problem. There was a game against the Vikings where he played for overtime and the Packers had, 60 yards to go to drive for a field goal and the ball with a minute and a half to go. And they infuriated James Lofton to no end. Like he was furious. Starr played it safe and they lost. It was still he went 52 and 76. I think he had a couple ties in there. In 9 years. The guy got 9 years, and he got a grace period there because he was recovering from the John Hadel trade. He took over for Dan Devine, but things just never went well. He beat I think 13 teams with winning records in his entire time in Green Bay. He was a great player, a great pillar of the community, a great man, but not a organization. Not a leader of the organization. I think he was adamant in his farewell press conference that he was leaving the team in better shape than he found it, and I think that's debatable. I mean, the Packers didn't really become a force on offense until Bob Schnelker took over from Starr as the offensive coordinator, I think in 82 or 83, and it was with Lynn Dickey. And I think most fans think of Starr and Dickey when they think of the 70s and 80s. With Lynn Dickey, the Packers became an offensive force with Bob Schnelker as their offensive coordinator.
Right. Yeah, and 9 years as a coach is something that with that little success just would never happen in today's NFL anywhere, and I think probably wouldn't have happened in Green Bay for anybody not named.
I don't think Tom Brady would get that kind of grace period in New England.
I don't think so. Especially after going to Tampa Bay last year and winning a Super Bowl. That might have soured them a little bit.
Right.
But, speaking of Lynn Dickey, this is a great shot of Bart Starr and Lynn Dickey. Lynn Dickey, like you said, was kind of a breath of fresh air when it came to offense, something that had been missing for pretty much the entire decade of the 70s. So maybe tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, one of the great personnel moves by Starr. He gave away a lot, I think, including John Hadel. I think he gave away four people to get him ultimately from Houston. Dickey was a good player, but because of injuries, one of which he suffered before he ever got to the Packers. He was tackled on the Astrodome turf, and his left knee hit the turf so hard that it dislodged the hip bone from the socket. Took off a piece of socket bone, I think, and it was a dashboard injury was the ER parlance for it. It was just a horrific deal. Dickey didn't play a full season in the NFL until he'd been in the league for 10 years.
That's crazy.
And he was a great passer. He was a terrific passer, but because of the injuries, and he had knee injuries and I think a shoulder injury and stuff, he had injury problems in Green Bay. He was a statue in the pocket, and if you could rush him, you could beat them. And so I think in 1980 or 1982, Dickey was sacked 40 times, which wasn't even the most in the NFL, believe it or not, but it was the second most. He was a limited passer, but when he had time, he was a great passer. I think probably besides the 72 season, there's like three moments from the 70s and 80s that define the Packers to their fans, and Lynn Dickey leading that victory over the Redskins on Monday night in '83 is one of them.
I think somebody's got to go back and do an audit on how many horrible injuries that Astrodome turf has caused over the years. I've heard some horror stories about that particular field, but Lynn Dickey, definitely one of the greats, and this next shot is actually one of my favorites. Just it almost paints the picture of exactly what you're describing. He's in the pocket. He's a statue back there surveying the field. Not a guy that's going to flush out and beat you with his legs. But, like you said, if you gave him the time, which it looks like maybe his offensive line is about to do here, he could sure spin it.
If he could give him the time, yeah, Dickey could sling it. It was with Paul Kaufman and with James Lofton, like he was just he had some real weapons.
Absolutely. And then moving on, speaking of James Lofton, probably, the best player from these eras, in my opinion. I mean, he's just one of those guys that was a dominant force. And maybe talk a little bit about what made him so special.
Sure. Well, he was, and it's a purely coincidence he played receiver, but I think he was probably the Packers' best. Well, he was their best receiver since Hudson, easily. Been a Hall of Famer, as everybody knows now. He was an industrial engineering major at Stanford, where he went on a track scholarship. He's a world-class track athlete. I think he had the second longest jump in the world in 1978. The second longest long jump in the world. He was a star from the moment he got to Green Bay. I think he was an All-Pro that year in '78. Or a Pro Bowler. They finished 8-7-1. They missed the playoffs, but Lofton was just a wonderful player. And '79 he got frustrated with Starr. There was a confrontation after that Minnesota game I mentioned.
Yeah.
But he turned things around and he became a organizational guy. He became their ambassador to the rest of the NFL. He was the Packers, not only their union representative but their United Way representative. He was a finalist for NFL Man of the Year one year. His wife, Beverly, sang the national anthem before Packers games. He was just a superstar and a beloved member of the community. And it made his departure in '87 all the more painful because, he was, as everybody now remembers, he was brought up on the sexual assault charges. His trial actually happened across the hall from Mossy Cade's trial. Their trials began on the same day. Mossy Cade was a much lower profile defensive back who had a much more serious charge against me. He ended up going to jail for 15 months for it. Lofton was acquitted in 4 days, by the way. He was found not guilty, but the Packers, it was already too late. The Packers had cut him loose a month before and traded him to the Raiders, I believe. And it was over. They kept Cade around. Cade was never off the roster until he was convicted. Lofton was cut loose before his trial began because he was high profile and it was too much bad publicity. Bob Harlan told me we had to stem the bleeding, and we did that by cutting the chains loose. And they felt terrible about it, but Lofton is reconciled with the team now. But just an unfortunate ending to a career, and sort of brought race relations in Green Bay to the forefront again in a way that was not didn't reflect well on the community or didn't reflect well on the team. And the Packers were backpedaling from that for a while.
Well, and that's a great point because, we had come from an era with Vince Lombardi where, super progressive that, he made a point to make sure that the town of Green Bay and that the way that team was run was all about equality. Everybody was equal. And it seemed like there was a bit of a regression post Lombardi. Maybe tell us a little bit about
Sure.
that and some of the things that impacted this decision.
Well, the Packers, I think the population in Brown County, the African-American population is minuscule. It's tiny. And the saying went, if you were a black man in Green Bay, you either were playing for the Packers or you were passing through. Mm-hmm. Was the unfortunate saying. Curly Lambeau never knowingly had an African-American play for his team. It took Gene Renzani, Lambeau's successor, to integrate the team, 5 or 6 years after the NFL had integrated itself.
Yeah.
But Vince Lombardi reversed all that, and by the end of Lombardi's tenure, the Packers were considered a model franchise of their time in terms of race relations. Lombardi went to the restaurant and bar owners of Green Bay and said, "Look, if you refuse service to one of my black players, you're not going to be none of my players. Nobody from the Green Bay Packers organization is going to dine or drink here." They were never. Dave Robinson told me they were never refused service. In Green Bay, Lombardi integrated the city in a lot of ways, and so, but when Lombardi left and the team became a laughing stock, and it became an unattractive place to go, like guys like the first round pick out of Penn State for nose tackle didn't want to go there because there were no black people. There were no barbers who cut the hair of black people. I think by the time Ron Wolf got there was a guy at the prison who did it. Like he came up once a month or something. It was a tough place for a black man to play because you were high profile and you stood out and you played for a bad team. It was just an uncomfortable place, and the Lofton incident, it was complicated in all sorts of ways. Like the Paul Hornung era Packers were the boys will be boys, and those are hard drinking, hard partying guys. And Lofton had been out for a night with friends. That was really what it amounted to. Nobody disputed the facts of the case of sexual assault. It was just whether force was used and force was involved. I think oral sex was what it was alleged, or what was it at the heart of the whole thing. But there was no forgiveness there. There was no leeway. Lofton was charged with a crime right away, and it was just it was a different time, and the team's relationship to the town was changing, and it took the Ron Wolf era to sort of make that right again. As we'll get into, but James Lofton was a symbol of great things and a symbol of less great things and complicated things for the city of Green Bay.
Yeah, an unfortunate ending to an amazing career in terms of what he was in Green Bay. Glad that they've reconciled things and pushed through that and are in a better spot now. And then we get to the Magic Man, Don Majkowski, and this is starting to get nostalgic for me because this is when I actually started becoming a fan of the Green Bay Packers, was watching Don Majkowski and that offense, and maybe if we can dive into, I think this is 1989, is that correct?
That's 89. That's after the instant replay review of the touchdown against the Bears that beat the Bears. Right. And when they gave 14-13, it was one of I don't have the records in front of me, but one of I want to say 3 to 5 games that they won by 1 point. They won another couple by 2 or 3 points. They just won a bunch of close games that year. It was Bob Harlan's first year as the president of the team. And the Packers went 10-6 and just missed the playoffs. Majkowski was runner-up for, NFL MVP. And, Harlan thought that the 89 was a harbinger of things to come. But, you win that many close games in the NFL, just like you do in baseball and any other sport, by a certain amount of luck. And the next year when Majkowski started having injury trouble, the luck ran out, and they were never as good then, which was unfortunate because he was a fun player. He didn't have the strongest arm. He was no Brett Favre, but he was fearless and he was dynamic. And in '89, everything went right, just about. And they missed the playoffs by a whisker, and it was just a magical season. And I think this is number 3 on the list of things people remember from the 70s and 80s, was this victory over the Bears. But it was just unfortunate that Harlan, you rewarded Lindy Infante with a contract extension, the coach. Harlan thought it was a sign of things to come, and it was not.
Sometimes we look at history and it kind of repeats itself, because I think we've had some Packers teams that have had some close calls and won some games by 1 possession. Now, I think the Packers actually ended up stepping it the other way, though, right? Where that 2019 team won a lot of games that were really close, and then the 2020 team definitely took another step forward. So I think that's kind of what Bob Harlan was hoping for when he made those moves, that it was going to take it to the next level. Doesn't always work out that way, unfortunately. But Don Majkowski will always have a special place in my heart, because that's when I started as a Canadian football fan to start to gravitate towards the Packers. So number 7 will always have a special place for me. Maybe not necessarily a GOAT, but a GOAT in my heart, we'll say. So moving on from Don, how can we talk about the 70s and the 80s and the GOATs without talking about maybe the biggest Packers draft bust, or that's what he's called in history, Mr. Tony Mandrich. So give us some history on what led up to this selection, and maybe who we didn't select instead of him. I don't know if we want to go there, but
Well, he ran a 4.65 40. He was just, there was no way. Like, he was a road grader in college. Like, Michigan State was a straight ahead power football team, and that's what he did. I think one of the Packers scouts was like, if the guy had played at Brigham Young, we'd have known about him like a long time before. Like, he was not. Mandarich could never adjust to the pass blocking that was required in the NFL. He was not he couldn't move his feet well enough to handle that. And so, he was he was a good journeyman pro. And if he'd have been a 5th round pick, nobody would have cared. But he came out of this covers a perfect example of the hype that was around him. He came out as the best offensive line prospect ever. And you could not take him. And Tom Bratz, who was, I think, the director of football operations or vice president of football operations, I think, not the GM, but he and Lindy and Fonnie were doing things. Tom Bratz took him at number 2 when I believe they could have had Barry Sanders if they'd waited, or if they'd taken Barry Sanders instead. And it was just that, Mandarich, he showed up to camp light. There were all sorts of rumors about steroids and stuff. He never was. I don't think he ever failed a drug test, but the legend that he was a creation of steroids did not disappear after he started playing in the pros. And when he played badly, I think there was a game in 90 or something like that where Reggie White, they played against the Eagles. They had just got drubbed by the Eagles, and Reggie White threw him around all over the field. They were basically the same size human, but Reggie was much faster, much quicker, and much stronger than Mandarich, and just had no chance. And he had a decent career in the NFL as like a journeyman offensive lineman, but he played some bad football in Green Bay. He was not a number 2 pick.
He was not a number 2 pick, and that's why maybe I take a little bit of an exception, though, with the biggest draft bust history, because he did have a reasonably long career in the NFL. He was an average journeyman offensive lineman. He wasn't a total flameout and out of the league in 2 years. I just think the context is you could have had Barry Sanders. That's the way it always feels for me. And anytime I see a picture of Tony Mandarich, I think of Barry Sanders in a Packers uniform, which is a painful thing to think about, because he was maybe, especially if he didn't retire early, one of if the not greatest running backs of all time. So, super interesting correlation there with how that pick affected 2 franchises, not just one. That's so. Right. Moving on from draft busts to our GOAT selections, I think these are pretty much slam dunks. Not the field that we had in the Lombardi era to choose from, but I think you and I both settled on Lynn Dickey and James Lofton. Are in your mind, are these guys heads and tails above the rest for the 70s and the 80s, Mark?
I think so. I mean, you could make an argument that Sterling Sharp belongs in here, but I know he played in the 80s. He caught the touchdown pass from Mikowski against the Bears. Sure. He caught really every big touchdown pass for the Packers back then. But I consider him a player from the 90s, the Ron Wolf era, is when I think he had his best best seasons and his most dynamic seasons. And so I put Lofton here, and but it's by the skin of his teeth, in terms of like distinguishing him from Sterling Sharp. And we'll get to Sterling later. I'm sorry.
Yep. Don't worry, Packers fans. We will get to Sterling Sharp. We are not going to leave him out here. But before we do that, we are going to be joined by our good friend of the show, Mr. Dusty Evely. Dusty, how you doing, my friend?
Good. Thanks for adding me in late, Ryan. I didn't want to be any part of talking bad about Bart Starr, so I appreciate you waiting to add me in there.
That's okay. I'll be the bad guy here. That's fine. I'm used to playing that role. That's totally fine. And to be fair, like, hey, Bart Starr is the fucking man, okay? And that will never change. But he just wasn't a great coach. He wasn't a great personnel guy, and that's okay. That doesn't take the shine off of Mr. Starr for me in any way, shape, or form. Because when I think of Bart Starr, I think about the man, I think about his relationship with the town, and I think about the player on the field. So we can just forget about the 70s in terms of Bart Starr's legacy. But important to talk about that. He definitely didn't hold it up there in terms of the coaching. But so as we kind of move move away from the forgettable era of the 70s and 80s. We're going to get into the Ron Wolf era. And Dusty, you have some interesting plays, some exciting plays that you want to break down for us. So let's see what you got, my friend.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. So I've got five plays across 3 games. We'll get through them quickly. So listen, You're seeing my screen now, and we'll do hide. I assume everyone knows what game this is from, correct? And I mean, this is when you think of Ron Wolf and you think of his impact. To me, I mean, this is the kickoff. This is Bart Starr coming in for the injured Don Mikowski against the Bengals. Robert Brooks had taken the kickoff and ran it out of bounds, and so they've got minute 7. They're down 6. No big deal. So a couple reasons I want to start off with this one, and we're going to end with the touchdown. But so in Favre's recollection, the Bengals blitzed him. He said every single down, every single drop back that he was in the game. And I can't remember his exact stats. I know he fumbled 4 times. I think he had a pick or 2 in there as well. Like, just horrendous game. Mark, I don't know if you know his what his numbers ended up being in that game or not.
I don't know exactly what they were, but it was he played badly for quite a while until like basically the fourth quarter. And then he started to come around. But all the bad hallmarks of Brett Favre were there in the first part of the game.
Yeah, lots of running around, and he even said later, he said, I this game and other games as well, they asked him why he ran around so much, and he said, well, I didn't know what I was seeing out there. Like, it was better than like trying to throw an interception. I would just run. So
if you look, like, he became the holder for place kicks for Chris Jackie because Mikowski went down and got hurt. And if you look at that, when Chris Jackie kicks the extra point after their last touchdown, Favre completely takes his hands off the ball.
Yeah, he has his finger on the nose right before the foot comes. He goes like this.
Right, exactly. And I mean, because Jackie missed 2 field goals with Favre as his holder, and Jackie never, they were not 48-yard field goals. They were decent field goals, but Jackie missed twice, and he was, it was not going well for Brett back there.
It wasn't. And so you've got, it's a minute 7 left. He hasn't really done much. And you've got, 7 guys in the box there. And so if they've been blitzing him all game, they're kind of expecting that again. And so the reason I bring this up, we're talking about Favre, we're talking about Holmgren. What they run, kind of a go route, and then that tight end off of here, and then they're running, kind of that split back set. They're running out there. Now, there are a couple of reasons they're doing this. One of the reasons they're doing this is you get out of the shadow of your end zone a little bit to start the drive. Second is you've got a young quarterback who, was been terrible, get him an easy completion. But the bigger thing, and this was a Holmgren thing, was see what coverage they're playing. What coverage are they playing? Are they going to come at us? Are they going to blitz? Or are they sitting back a little bit? So what ends up happening, you can't really see because there's a guy over here. But I guess we'll go pre-snap here. We'll look at the pre-snap. You can see just based on the alignment here, and it depends on like the drops of some of these guys, that if this guy runs with this guy, that's a free release. And there's safeties in their back. 7, then you got 2 guys up there. You can't see the safety over there. So what ends up happening here is they fall back into cover 2. You can't see it. That's a free release there. So that's their indicator. All right, they're not coming. They brought 4. They ran cover 2. We've got stuff up underneath, and beyond the stuff they've got underneath in cover 2, what you get is it's the famous turkey hole that John Gruden talks about. You hit the shallow cornerback on the side, passes off the receiver underneath, and passes him off to the safety. But there's a natural void in that coverage zone, and so you can hit guys down there. So the next play, I'm not going to show the next play. Next play, they hit Sterling Sharp in there, and then Sharp goes down with an injury, stays in for 1 or 2 more plays until they can spike the ball. But Favre has already seen, okay, they've played. It's this play, next one, and they've got one other play. They play cover 2 the entire time. He knows he can hit the shot. He knows exactly what they're doing. So with that in mind, this is the big one here. So we're looking the same thing. This ends up being the call was 2 jet all go. So what they're doing, you can't see the safeties. What they've got with the safeties, you've got a safety back here and a safety back here. So you can't see that. And then they're just running. They're going. And that's the important one there. So they're just running right at them. So that's important because you've got this guy split here. And this will come up again in a second. You've got this guy split here, essentially running right at this high safety here on this side. And that's Kittrick Taylor on the outside. Again, Taylor fast. I think he caught 28 balls or something up until this point. I don't think he's ever caught a touchdown before, but he's in because Sharp went down with an injury. And I think Favre even said, like, I didn't really care who was out there. I just knew that's where I was going because that's where it made sense to go. So I'm unclear whether Favre even knew that Sharp was out of the game at this point. There's a man out there, and I will throw to that man. It doesn't particularly matter who that man is. So what happens then? Because they know it's cover 2. Favre pumps. So when he pumps, and you can't see any of this, you don't have the coach's film because it's from 1982. Over here, picture him out here. We'll picture him right out there. That safety where that tight end was running up freezes. Instead of going over the top of the outside man, he freezes because the pump up the seam. So he has to freeze. And when he freezes, that gives Favre all the time he needs. Just guns that sucker to Kittrick Taylor. Touchdown. No, so the couple reasons that this is, clearly this is a big play because this was Favre coming in. This was his big first comeback. He came in for Mikowski. He started, 200 blah, 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 blah games after this, all of that. But it's also, again, he played terrible. And this was Wolf's big thing, right? Wolf comes in. So he not only brings in Favre, he trades for Favre. He gives up a first-round pick. Favre was a second-round pick the year before. I looked this up. This is like the equivalent of if in 2020, the Packers decided instead of drafting a quarterback, they would give up a first-round pick for Drew Lock, who was a second-round pick the year before. Only Drew Lock had thrown 4 passes, and both of them were picks in his whole rookie year. That's what that trade is the equivalent of if you're looking at that today, which is insanity. Like, that's insane. Then he brings in Holmgren, who, again, Holmgren draws up that first play, get his young guy the early completion, find out it's cover 2, and then you've got Favre in the mix too. And so this is like, just to me, you couldn't script this any better, but you have the guy that Wolf pulled the trigger on having a huge comeback, and the coach that he brought in to coach that guy calling up just, a great play to kind of feel out the defense and all of that stuff beforehand. So when I think of you kick off the Ron Wolf era, really, it's the perfect play. It's the perfect game for that. But for all those reasons, kind of everything kind of combines there in that. So that's the first game there. The second one I want to look at, which, we know what this is. This is the first Lambeau Leap. This is 93. So they end up housing the Raiders in this game. I can't remember the temperature. It was like -20 wind chill, I think, on this day. I think it's, week 16, second to last game of the season. The Packers are closing in, win this game. And, they got a pretty good chance of making the playoffs, which they do at the end of the 93 season for, I think, only the second time since 73. So what they end up doing here, they're loading up. They've got 7 or 8 guys, but they're really just bringing 4 guys, and these other guys all drop back. So they're basically overloading this side over here. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's Butler out here. I've got a reason for all this. So it's Butler out there. They're overloading the side, trying to get some pressure, which ends up working. And one of these men, this man right here, is Reggie White, which, again, important. I think 93 was White's first year. That was White's first year in Green Bay.
That's right.
So we know what happens. He drops back. Pressure comes in. He throws. Now, you can see this kind of coming up there. That's Butler coming in, just screaming like a bat out of hell right there. And so Butler comes in. He reads this. They're setting up this screen here, which, could kind of work because you've got that overload blitz to that side. You're running that rush. And so you kind of got guys kind of going away from there. It's not a bad call. Butler sees it, recognizes these are the 2 blockers here. Butler gets past those 2 blockers, blows up the play. Like, just absolutely ridiculous. Ball comes flying out. Reggie White picks it up. His heel's not out of bounds. He's in bounds the entire time. Don't worry about that. If replay was still around, that would have been fine. And then Butler runs and says, hey, get me. So to me, and this is another one, a couple different reasons. 93, first year with Reggie White. Everyone knows the Reggie White story. I don't know if Mark's going to go into that in a little bit or not, but we've got Reggie White's there for the first year. This is the first time they've made the playoffs since 82, I think, was the last time they'd made the playoffs before 93. And the 2 guys this involves, the 2 main players in this, are Reggie White, which was the big free agent acquisition, and Leroy Butler, who, if I'm not mistaken, is one of only 2 players that were there before Wolf got there that were still there in 96 that won the Super Bowl. It was Chris Jackie and Leroy Butler. So you think the main players here, it was White, the big free agent acquisition that kind of helped push them over the top, and Butler, the all-world, should be Hall of Fame safety.
Thank you.
That or for 1,000 reasons that made this play. And again, this was kind of the icing on the cake. This was the fourth quarter. They're going to win this game anyway. They lose the next week to the Lions, but they end up making the playoffs anyway. So this helped them get into the playoffs here. And you got these two main players that Wolf had a big hand of bringing in. So you can't bring up the Ron Wolf era without bringing this up for his involvement in bringing these guys in, or for bringing Reggie in, and for Lori's involvement here. And then the culmination of this is Reggie White. It's Reggie White, and so he had 3 sacks in the Super Bowl. I'm going to show 2 because this is the big moment. There he is right there. So the reason we're showing 2, these happen back to back. I assume everyone knows these, so I won't spend a whole lot of time. Everyone knows what these are, but he has these 2 back to back. It's 35-21 in the third quarter. So the Packers are up comfortably, but the Patriots had some pretty quick strikes here. They're on the 30, so if they get going, they score a touchdown here, the game's very, very far from over. Reggie White, he does the he'd been kind of hitting the wide, hitting that corner all night. So Max Lane, as we'll see, kind of sets up for that, but then Reggie White hits him with the hump. So he's been setting him up, gets him out wide. You can see, this is one of those, as soon as you pause it, you're like, he's already in trouble. He's out, right there, man. He's out over his skis. He's playing speed. That's exact. He's only looking for speed. And then Reggie hits him with the hump, comes back inside. I just feel bad for him. I look at this screenshot and I just feel bad for him. He doesn't know what's about to happen. Just thrown, and then Bledsoe goes down and Reggie White gets all excited. So you've got that. So that happens. And then the very next play, again, 2 touchdowns and they're down. It's Reggie again on the outside. We go here, right there. And this time, because he had just embarrassed Max Lane in the outside, so Lane is then setting up outside. Reggie White just hits him with a speed move, hits him to the outside. And you can see him this time. You can see him eyeing. He's right there. He's eyeing that inside shoulder. That's his target. He's looking. I don't care what happens. I'm not getting thrown to the turf again by Reggie White. So he's not hitting me with the hump move. He's not hitting with the hump move. But all it does is get him out of position. He dips. Sack. 2 sacks in a row. We're now under 2 minutes to go in the third. Patriots are left to punt. Game over at this point. So again, we looked at that first play. That was Favre's first comeback for homegrown and Favre. We looked at the Lambeau Leap, which was bringing in Reggie and Leroy Butler, one of the guys who survived through all the Wolf cuts. And then it all culminates in a Super Bowl victory with Reggie White, the big free agent acquisition, getting 2 huge sacks to, essentially ice the game still in the third quarter here. So those are my plays that I'm looking at that I think all kind of, for me, when I think of this era, these are the plays that kind of show kind of what Ron Wolf was to the Packers and what these kind of players did while in Green Bay.
Couldn't agree more, man. All good selections, all ones that I remember very fondly. We've got TBM Nate 23 saying he loves learning about the Ron Wolf era, and that's why we're here, man. We're here to shed some light on these eras, and we're happy to have you along for the ride. So let's get back to some players and see what GOAT nominees that we have for the Ron Wolf era. And we can't really start, with our nominees without starting with Ron Wolf, right? Isn't that kind of how that goes, guys? Ron Wolf?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, Ron Wolf and Bob Harlan had met before. In '87, Wolf came into Green Bay to interview for the job. I think he was in the front office of the Raiders at the time, and he was interviewing for the job that eventually went to Tom Bratz. And as Wolf told me about it, it was there was no final authority. There was no ultimate authority. There was nobody clearly in charge, and I just wasn't going to be a part of that. And so, after interviewing with Judge Perrins, who was the Packers president at the time, he slept on it, and he called Bob Harlan the next day, and he said, "I'm out." But Bob Harlan never forgot it because they got along so well. Bob Harlan was impressed by Ron Wolf's memory and his mind, his reputation. He'd been in a intelligence unit in the Army in Berlin in the 50s and 60s, I think, and he always had a reputation. The rumor in the NFL was that he had been an Army spy. He'd been a government spy. He was a G-man. He was James Bond. He was not, but Ron, he did have an excellent. He knew players. He knew player evaluation. and he had an excellent recall for players. And Bob Harlan, he considered two guys for the job of GM, or he considered one guy really. I think Wolf considered two guys for coach, but Harlan only really considered Ron Wolf. And he went to the executive board in '91, and he was like, "Look, this is just not working. The business model, if Tom Bratz and Lindy and Fonnie don't agree, then the decision goes to me, and I don't know anything about football. I'm an executive, so you need somebody in charge of football who knows football inside and out to run the football operation, run all the operations. Everybody answers to him, to one guy, and he made Ron Wolf that guy. And when Ron Wolf was considering the job that Harlan offered him, he talked to Al Davis, and Al Davis said to him, you're going to be like an owner with all the power you're going to have. So you'd be a fool not to take it. And Wolf took it and did everything he ever wanted to do, which we'll get to that in a second. But one of them was Brett Favre.
Yeah, and it's a structure that served the Packers well for a very long time before Ron Wolf and before Bob Harlan, and getting back to kind of their roots of having one throat to choke kind of philosophy in terms of football operations, right? So,
but importantly, Ron Wolf wasn't going to be the coaching GM. He was just going to be the GM, and it was all his responsibility. And that was the key. I mean, that's what in the 70s, they kept messing up. They kept giving one guy two jobs, and it just didn't work anymore.
Should have listened to Lombardi when he said they needed to split those roles, probably, and maybe we would have had more to review in the 70s and 80s had that been the case. But thankfully, they righted the course. Bob Harlan made the right choice. He got Ron Wolf, who then turned around and hired his coach, Mike Holmgren.
There were two guys he was considering for the job. He wanted Parcells or he wanted Holmgren. Holmgren, had been the architect of one of the best offenses in the league, and I think in '86, when Joe Montana was down with an injury, he went like 4-3-1 with two journeyman quarterbacks whose names escape me at this point, but he tremendously impressed Ron Wolf. And he just, Holmgren was the hottest coaching candidate in the league at the time, and Wolf wanted him. Bob Harlan told him, "You do what you want, man." And he went out and got Mike Holmgren. And it was a coup. It was a coup at the time, even before they got Brett Favre and before they went after Reggie White. Getting Holmgren was he was the most coveted coaching candidate in the league.
Yeah, and obviously, there's a portent of things to come here. We've got Mr. Favre just creeping behind the shoulder of Mike Holmgren. Just hopefully he hadn't just thrown a pick or something and got chewed out by Mike, which was often the case on the sidelines. But definitely one of the key pieces to the Packers' run of success in the Ron Wolf era. So moving on from the svelte version of Mike Holmgren,
the cantilever to his gut didn't come till years later.
After many years of interceptions and things like that, stress relief. We all have our vices, right, Mark?
I think this picture is actually after the playoff victory over the Lions in '94. But this is, right. I mean, this is the image a lot of people have of the two guys, Favre somewhat distracted, sort of a grin creeping onto his face, and Holmgren coaching him right there. You can see the look on his face. He's trying to impart something to Favre. I don't know if Favre's taken it, but that was this. I thought this photo sort of epitomized the relationship between the two men. It was, Favre's best years were under Holmgren. After Holmgren, it was a somewhat steady slide down for Favre in terms of the interceptions and the yardage and stuff like that. And he was never as good as he was under Holmgren because Holmgren was such a fierce taskmaster with him. He was not. He didn't let Favre get away with stuff. Favre got away with stuff anyway, but it wasn't because Holmgren was letting him do it.
It's the ultimate what did Holmgren do in a former life to deserve this? You think of Holmgren coming from, very much under that Walsh tree, very much of a Walsh disciple of put the ball where you want it, 3 steps and it's out, blah, blah, blah. And then it's Favre that just whatever I want to do. I can fit the ball in there. It's just the differences of those two styles. I don't know how they didn't kill each other. It's amazing.
That first game, that Bengals game, Dusty, Holmgren's comment after the game was he was calling formations. I had no idea what they were. All the hallmarks of Brett Favre that were to come were there on display in that game, and in one way or another, including the just the way he used to infuriate Holmgren, or amuse him or amuse him.
Well, and I think it's a great point, though, to show like you saw all those same characteristics with Favre right out of the gate, and it was Holmgren that reined him in enough to get that talent. You're never going to get the gunslinger out of Brett Favre, but Holmgren was able to rein him in to some degree, at least at a level of success that no other coach was able to, for the tenure of his career, maybe outside of, that last year in Green Bay for Favre in 2007. There was a little bit of some of that reminiscent, QB play from him, but Holmgren and Favre was always such an interesting dynamic, and I don't think you can talk about the success or some of the failures as we'll touch on down the road without talking about that relationship. So, and this picture, like you said, Mark, is Favre even looking or listening to Holmgren in this picture? Like, I don't think he is. Like Holmgren's
I think photos are such a funky thing. Like it's I'm pretty sure they're actually talking to each other, but just the image they captured of Favre kind of looking away, and you can see the grin kind of coming up there. Like it's just, to me, it was a perfect shot.
He's got some smart ass remark on the tip of his tongue. You just know it, right? So great shot here. And then let's talk about the man, the myth, the legend, Brett Favre, sure. Right? I mean, if we're going to talk about the 90s and the Ron Wolf era, in terms of players, we're starting with number 4.
Sure. Well, he was. Yeah, I mean, I think you can make a case for Brett Favre as the all-time GOAT for the Packers. He belongs up there. If you're making Mount Rushmore, I think he's got to be one of the faces. He played for his dad in high school. He was a coach's kid, and his dad ran the wishbone. Favre was a wishbone quarterback in high school, and he went to Southern Miss. He was a defensive back, but he quickly, in his freshman year, he became their starter quarterback. It was very good. He beat Leroy Butler in Florida State one year when they were highly ranked. But he had a horrible car accident before his senior season. And missed the first game. It was like sort of he was 15 pounds underweight. He was just not quite the same player in the first chunk of his, the first half of the senior season that he'd been the year before. And it was his senior year where Ron Wolf was down at Southern Miss. Ron Wolf, who was I think at that point was working with the Jets in their front office. Ron Wolf was down there, and he was looking at tape of Favre as a senior, and he thought he looked okay. And then there was a guy in the Southern Miss football office who was like, you should check out the tape of his junior year. And so Ron Wolf watched it and came away from that specific trip, convinced that Favre was the best player in the 1991 draft. There was, and he and the Jets tried to draft him, but the Atlanta Falcons got him one pick before the Jets went. The Jets wound up taking Browning Nagel. But Ron Wolf resolved that he'd been in the mid 70s, he'd been made the first GM of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but they hadn't made him the GM. They'd made him the director of player personnel, and John McKay had a lot of say, and John McKay was good friends with the owner, and Ron Wolf saw his power diminishing there. And when the Buccaneers were so bad their first 2 seasons, somebody had to get cut, and so they cut him loose. And he never forgot that lesson. The titles mean something. And so, but he resolved that if he ever got a chance to run an NFL team again, he was going to make Brett Favre his quarterback. Brett Favre was buried on the depth chart in Atlanta. Jerry Glanville hated him. And he got into like 2 games. I think, Dusty, you had the stats. He threw I think one of them was a pick 6. I think his first NFL pass.
I know he was 0 for 4 with 2 interceptions, and I think he had a sack or 2 in there as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was not promising stuff, but Ron Wolf knew what he was doing, and the Packers, their comment, Holmgren's comment after they traded for Favre, because they had 2 first-round picks that year. They took Terrell Buckley, and they traded one of them away to get Brett Favre. And Holmgren was like, well, we were going to use one of them on a quarterback anyway. So, but let's get somebody we wanted. And Ron Wolf really wanted Brett Favre, and he made it his mission to go find him. His old buddy from the Raiders, Ken Herrick, was the Falcons GM at the time. I think the Falcons had a director of player personnel. I don't think even he was the GM title. But Herrick traded Favre to Ron Wolf for a first-round pick. And that was in February of 92. And it really, I I think the resurrection, Reggie White did what he did, but I think the resurrection began that day in 1992. I think a lot of people don't look back on it now. There was a lot of vitriol against Wolf for trading away a first-round pick, but that was the galvanizing moment. Was trading for Brett Favre, and that photo is from Dusty. That may have been the pass. I don't know, but that photo is from that Bengals game.
Yeah, it's either that pass or interception, right?
Yeah, that third photo is a great photo, but that's the Super Bowl loss to the Broncos. We'll talk about that later. But that's
yeah, no, and it's so interesting because I was in a Twitter, argument with a Bears fan this week where they said that
satisfying kind of argument, the Twitter argument. Those always
those are just the best kind. And I'm actually not the one that gets sucked into those most of the time, but I just couldn't resist because they said that we stumbled into Favre, and the story behind that is anything but. Like before it was even the Packers GM, Ron Wolf knew that was his guy. And
yeah, he saw him at the Senior Bowl after Favre's senior season, and
exactly
Favre better. Like he was convinced. He was absolutely dead sure that he was the best quarterback in that draft.
No question. So anybody that thinks we just stumble into amazing quarterbacks, no, there was some hard work. There was some hard scouting. We gave up a first-round pick for a player that was drafted in the second round. Like you said, Dusty trading a first-round pick for Drew Lock would be the equivalent of that. And just imagine Packers Twitter if that's what happened. It would have blown up. But like you said, Mark, there was some vitriol around giving up that first-round pick, but I don't think anybody was mad at it for very long after that, right? So
no, it took
Brett Favre,
yeah,
definitely. I think you hit it as perfectly as you could. He's on the Mount Rushmore. If he's not the only one up there, he's definitely up there, right? So Brett Favre is absolutely one of the GOATs. And moving on, I mean, who's next? And it's got to be Reggie White, right?
So this was 1993, and then this was the day they signed in April. That they signed Reggie White and introduced him to the media in Green Bay. I mean, there's a lot of White was a devout Baptist minister, and there's a legend about Holmgren's phone message to him, which was this is God, come to Green Bay. That Ron Wolf took him out for dinner or lunch on Reggie's one visit to Green Bay during his free agency tour. He took him to Red Lobster down the road from Lambeau Field, which is the Red Lobster, which is still there. And said, he told him, he's like, if you go anyplace else, you're going to be a great player, you'll be an all-pro, but if you come here, you're going to be a legend. That all made a difference, but because of their position at the bottom of the NFL, like the Packers were able to make a very, very good offer to White, and it was the best offer. So he not only did all the great existential, esoteric things, but he signed for the most money. And I think that's an important part of the Reggie White deal was, the Niners offered him a really good deal, but the Niners, because they'd done so well the year before, were hamstrung by NFL rules and into what they could offer to White up front. And they couldn't make quite as sweet a deal as Green Bay could. Signing Reggie White, it was a mechanical thing and an existential thing all at the same time. I mean, in a lot of ways, Reggie White redeemed the franchise. Ron Wolf, he brought Reggie. African-American players wanted to play in Green Bay. All of a sudden, they've got a great quarterback. They've got the best defensive player in football. Ron Wolf made changes to the culture in Green Bay. He started bringing in a barber from Milwaukee once a week to cut black players' hair. They started serving soul food they got from a restaurant in Milwaukee once a week. He went out of his way to sort of change the culture. And I think that, the problems that were exacerbated by the Lofton situation, I think Reggie White did a lot to redeem the franchise. He may not have saved it. I think you can make the case that Favre saved it, but Reggie redeemed it in a lot of ways. And he was also just a wonderful player. I mean, he was big and fast. He'd thrown Tony Mandarich around a couple of years before. He had like 20 sacks in 12 games in the strike season of 87 or 88. He was just a dominant player, and Green Bay's defense became instantly better. And it's also 93 was the year that Leroy Butler figured out how to play safety. They moved him there the year before. And Reggie White's addition made the emergence of Leroy Butler possible. I mean, just all sorts of great things began to happen when Favre and Reggie White were added to the mix.
Well, when we were chatting about Reggie yesterday, that 20 sack, 12 game season, like that's the best pass rushing season of all time, in my opinion. Like 20 sacks in 12 games, if he plays 14 games or, 16 games or 17 games now, like that 22.5 record is way destroyed by Reggie White.
Yeah.
Maybe Dusty, like what made Reggie White so dominant in terms of his play? I mean, for those that maybe didn't get to see him play live, what set him apart from all the other great players in the NFL?
He's a big dude that was very aggressive and very fast and just country strong, man. Like just that that hump move, like you've seen guys do it. Like
Sure.
no one could do it like Reggie. I mean, you can't do that unless you've got speed, because you've got to set someone up from the outside, get them off balance, and then you just take that one arm and then you throw a 300-pound man with your off arm. I mean, it's all, it's balance and all that. So you do have to get him leaning, but I mean, it's his speed, it's aggression. One of my favorite plays of his from when he was an Eagle was a stand-up sack of, I can't remember who he sacked, where he just like manhandled the ball out of his hand and then ran it back for a touchdown. It was like a bear attacking a child. Like he was just so huge. And that's the thing. I mean, he got to Green Bay, still, amazing in Green Bay, obviously, but in his prime, like lightning quick. And just he looked like he was bigger and stronger than everyone else on the field, and he played just a ferocity, man. Which, I mean, you hear some of those stories about him, kind of talking to guys across the line from him and everything. Like he could talk, but a lot of it was, I'll pray for you, I'll pray for you. I'm gonna put you in your grave. Yeah, I mean,
there are some stories from his past, like when he would get frustrated as a kid, he would go out into the woods and just beat a stick against the side of a tree in anger and, fury. Like he had a lot, like Dusty said, he was very aggressive. There were some incidences from his younger life, and he talks about it in his autobiography. Like, he became somewhat of a bully for Christ after he became redeemed. He was, he's like, I'm going to pray for you, but he was also like, he was not a pushover. He was a tough man, and he was. I think Dusty hit on his speed and his strength were just off the charts, but it was also like the inner motor was something different with Reggie. It was he was on full go all the time.
Well, he was going to pray for you, but he was going to be the one that put you into the situation where you needed prayers. That's pretty much how it went down.
Well, he had that play where he threw Chris Carter into Warren Moon, and they asked him about it. He didn't even know what it was until after he saw it in his film study, and he was like, "Oh, I didn't know I threw him." It's just kind of whatever I need to do to get to the quarterback, right? Like whatever I need to do, I'll get there and I'll figure out how I did it later.
What do you think is running through Chris Carter's head as he sees Reggie White coming towards him? And just like you said, it's like children trying to fight a bear out there. I don't even think he knew that Chris Carter was in his general direction. It was like swatting a fly out of his way. Yeah. It was hilarious.
Just something to throw. Just a piece of garbage to throw,
exactly.
Man.
Chris Carter was the stick and Warren Moon was the tree in that scenario. So gotta love it. Reggie White. I remember having a poster of Reggie White on my wall as a kid for a number of years. Like he was the best, in terms of a defensive player. I'd argue he's the best ever. I know there's other guys you're going to put in that consideration, but hey, I'm a biased Packer fan. What do you want from me? All right. Well, let's, as hard as it is for me to move on from Reggie, let's keep it rolling here, guys. Great shot here of probably the two greatest players from that era. Maybe we can throw Leroy Butler's in the background there somewhere, but I wonder what I got to think he's probably reading some scripture to Favre here.
That's before the 95 championship game against the Cowboys. And they're going over the Bible. We're just talking about the Bible with Favre in the locker room before the game. Those two guys together, I think were, the greatness that came to Green Bay was started with those two. Ron Wolf was the architect, but they carried out his mission on the field, and it was just, it was a magical kind of pairing. In a lot of ways, an unlikely pairing. what we know about
Very
Favre.
polar opposite dudes, right? Like Brett Favre and Reggie White were definitely wired different, but when they got out on the field, they had that same mentality. Was just I'm going to go out and I'm better than everybody else in front of me, and they kind of put the proof in the pudding there. Absolutely. All right, so moving on, we talked about him a little bit in the 70s and 80s, and to your point, Mark, we felt that he belonged in the 90s era in terms of where he put his stamp on the organization. And I'll let you go in a second, but I just want to say Sterling Sharpe might be the best football player I ever have watched personally, like got to see play live. I know there's lots of great players, but that dude was a beast and literally destroyed everybody that tried to cover him. Injury cut his career short, but maybe talk about what made him so great.
Well, he was big and strong and fast. I mean, a lot of the attributes that made Reggie White great are common to a lot of great football players. But Sharpe was, I mean, if you look at the box scores from games going back into the 80s and his beginning of his career, whoever was throwing the ball, like he and Brett Favre is a magical pairing, but like whoever was throwing the ball, Sterling Sharpe was catching touchdowns from him. Sterling Sharpe was he was on the receiving end of he was on the receiving end of like big plays in that Bengals game. He caught a touchdown in that Bengals game. He caught the pass against the Bears in '89. The instant replay touchdown. It's hard to separate. A lot of the great things the Packers did, in the Ron Wolf era began with Sterling Sharpe. The Packers never quite had a receiver as great, and I think until Davante Adams, haven't had a receiver as great as Sterling Sharpe, for a lot of reasons. And it's really a sad end to his career was the injury situation, because he was. You could make a case for him for the Hall of Fame now.
Hey, like we said the other day, Mark, like if Terrell Davis is in with a shortened career, I mean, why not Sterling Sharpe? I mean, he was that dominant. And I love the comparison to Davante Adams, because when you say no matter who was throwing him the ball, he was putting up numbers and touchdowns. It reminded me of Davante Adams when we had the Brett Hundley behind center with the year that Rodgers was down. Dude was still killing people out there. It didn't matter that Aaron Rodgers wasn't there. Maybe that's a stretch, but I mean, Brett Hundley is not a world beater, folks, and Davante Adams still got his. What is that an apt comparison in terms of their play style, Dusty, or what would you say was Sterling's biggest strength on the field aside from the obvious?
I mean, entirely different styles, I would say. I mean, Sharpe was, Adams wins with his feet, precision route running, and Sharpe could certainly do that. But Sharpe won because Sharpe could win because he was bigger and faster than anyone else out there. Like, tremendous hands, but I mean, you had to commit guys to him. You had to commit to him over the top. Say Adams move, he gets you off the line and then he gets you down the field, but he doesn't have that breakaway speed. Sharpe could run past you. He could run through you. And he caught everything. I mean, that's the thing. It's a freight train, right? Choo choo. Big, strong, and fast, and caught everything. I mean, one of the touchdowns, you talk about all the touchdowns he caught, was at the Lions playoff game was at 93, right? He caught the game winner in that Favre tossed roughly 120 yards is my understanding based on where he was on the field and all that stuff.
One side of the field to the other, pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. Sharpe could beat you however Sharpe wanted to beat you, because he was, I mean, elite. That's the thing. If he played another, even just 2 years, I think lock for the Hall of Fame. Like you said, I think he should be in now. Just pure dominance when he was out there. Did whatever he wanted to do.
100%. Hall of Fame, hear us. I know you're watching right now. Please get this man in there. There's a couple of guys that we want to make that plea for in this episode. So we will get there. And, well, we're going to get there right away. Now, you touched on it, Dusty. This man, Leroy Butler, the creator of the Lambeau Leap, the first hybrid role type safety, before that was a cool thing to do, there was Leroy Butler, and he is absolutely a dominant defensive player. So where do we start? Why he's not in the Hall of Fame, I don't know, especially with guys like Atwater and Lynch going ahead of him, who he was clearly better than. There's no argument. But what makes him a GOAT aside from some of the obvious things we've talked about? Mark, I'll throw it to you.
For me, it's what you said. I mean, he was an all-world coverage safety, all-world back-end safety that also was like an all-world blitzer, all-world linebacker when they needed to be. He was formidable in the box, like big, stout guy, fast, good tackler. Just knew, like one of those guys knows for the ball, knew where it was going, knew where he needed to be, knew what he needed to do, and just did it. So I mean, that was a guy you could put him back and you knew, okay, well, I know the back end of the field is covered because Laurie Butler's back there. If you're blitzing him, you know he's going to pick his spot, and you knew he was going to be just dynamite in the run game. So I mean, he's one of those guys, wherever you put him, you rotate him down, you rotate him up, you knew exactly what you're getting with him, and he was just excellent across the board, wherever you put him.
He could play. That really was the revolutionary aspect of Butler's career. Was he was not the guy he replaced, I believe, at free safety was his position was Mark Murphy, not Mark Murphy, the Packers president, but Mark Murphy, the bald Mark Murphy, who was a good in the box safety, was what one of the Packers assistants called him when I talked to him about him. Laurie Butler could be a great in the box safety, but he could also be a great coverage safety. And he was moved to safety by Ray Rhodes because he needed somebody back there who was a playmaker, who could be as good in run coverage and pass as he was in pass coverage. And then the revelation about Leroy was he was also a fantastic blitzer. He was just sort of a talent that there was no parallel for in the mid '90s. He could do all sorts of things great. I think one of the most telling things about Leroy Butler is like when the Broncos beat the Packers in the Super Bowl in 1997. Their game plan was specifically centered around taking away Leroy Butler's effectiveness. It was not Reggie White they were planning for. They had to account for Reggie White, but they were worried about what Leroy Butler could do to them. And I think that's significant. I mean, Leroy was, I think the prototype for guys like Troy Polamalu and all those guys you see creeping up to the flat in the formations now. Are they going to drop back in coverage, or are they going to blitz? And that all began with Leroy, who was just a unique thing in the NFL at the time. Fritz Shermer said there were safeties who were always around the ball, and there were safeties who were never around the ball. And mostly there were safeties who were never around the ball. He's like, if Leroy's out there, he is around wherever the ball is. He's around it. He's there, which I think is pretty good encapsulation of his career. And I wrote this book, and I came away from the writing of the book, convinced that Vern Llewellyn was the very first man who had to go into the Hall of Fame from the Packers. I was going to champion Vern Llewellyn for the Hall of Fame, and then guys like Atwater and Lynch, who were fine players, began making it. And it would just confuse me. But they there are guys who, John Lynch is still a inside member of the NFL's network. He's a good GM of a very good team, and everybody in the NFL knows him. Leroy Butler's doing, internet videos with Tom Silverstein. He's in Milwaukee, which it's not a judgment on what he's doing, but he's got no champion. He was drafted by Tom Bratz and Lindy Infante, both of whom had sort of middling NFL careers, and both of whom have since passed away. And there's nobody to really take up Leroy's mantle and champion him for the Hall of Fame the way that he deserves to be touted, because he was a transcendent player and clearly better than Lynch and Atwater. And I just, he's got to go. Leroy's got to go, and Vern Llewellyn I'll make my case for him later, but Leroy Butler will yesterday.
Well, and I agree. Like, I'm not saying Lynch and Atwater don't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. I'm just saying they don't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame ahead of Leroy Butler. To me, Butler was definitely a better player, especially when you look at that sacks. Like, sacks are so valuable for a defense in the NFL. He ended up with more than 20 sacks, I think, as a safety, right?
20 and a half regular season, I believe. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Which at the time, like, was ridiculous. I mean, that's still a ridiculous stat today, but guys like Atwater and Lynch did not affect the game in that way. And for that and that alone, I'm going to say the fact that those two guys are in has got to mean that Butler will get in, right?
I think the trend is moving Leroy's way. Like when I wrote, even when I wrote my book, which was like, I think I finished in mid 2000, early 2019. Like there were only like 11 guys, I think, who played exclusively or mostly safety who were in the Hall of Fame. And Atwater and Lynch, and I think somebody did Dawkins get in recently? Like, they started to put in safeties on their own merit, but there were very few safeties in the Hall of Fame, like, well, after Leroy Butler retired and for the next couple of years. And so I think people just didn't think of safeties in a lot of ways, for want of a better way to say it. But like, I think they're thinking of them now.
Well, hopefully that logjam gets busted down, because if he's not in next year, we riot, Packers fans. All right, let's go.
We may have to riot. I don't know when it's
Absolutely. And while we're rioting, we'll get Vern Llewellyn in there as well. All right, Mark, don't you worry. All right, so moving on from Leroy Butler, Dorsey Levens, one of my favorite running backs. One of the players I feel is like super underappreciated in terms of, looking back on Packers history. So let's chat about what made him, the versatile piece that he was.
Well, he had some really great seasons, and the '97 season especially. Like he ran for a ton of yards in the playoffs before they got to the Super Bowl. The tragedy of Levens' career was that the Denver defense in that Super Bowl, in terms of yards per carry, which they were giving up like 4.74 yards a rush, I think, was at the time the worst run defense in the history of the Super Bowl. And the Packers spent the game not exploiting it, really. I mean, Levens ran for 90 yards on 19 carries, but he didn't have a carry after like the 10-minute mark of the fourth quarter. When the Packers needed to control the ball, Holmgren was trying to throw it. And, to Ron Wolf's consternation, Ron Wolf gave a kind of a controversial interview about this years later. He refused to keep a back end to help block for Favre because the Broncos were blitzing Favre on every down. The playbook on Favre had not changed. From 92 to 97, they would blitz him on every down, or as much as you can. And that's what the Broncos did to him. And the Broncos were a good blitzing team. Atwater got to him. I think that sack picture that you had earlier in the show was Atwater sacking Favre. But Dorsey Levens, they could have, even with it, they lost enough defensive linemen early in that game. The NBC crew never pointed it out. Reggie White did not play well. The Broncos did their best to take away Leroy Butler, and the Packers were still in position to win that game. And my feeling is if they invested a little bit more in Dorsey Levens, in what he could do and what he could do against that defense, especially, which he was averaging like over 5 yards a carry. They could have won that game. It really is. I think if you want to look at the Packers as like a team that keeps losing these oh my god kind of games. It begins with that Super Bowl because they were 11.5-point favorites. People just did not think they were going to lose that game, they did quite spectacularly.
Yeah, no, that's okay. We've
bring the room down.
we are Packers fans, and we are used to heartbreak. We have thick skin, like this whole Aaron Rodgers offseason. It's water off a duck's back for me. I went through Favre. This will be nothing. But maybe one thing that I think is underappreciated about Levens in particular, not just his pure running skill, but the man was really good out of the backfield. A really good receiver, screen pass. Like the guy could run routes, right, Dusty?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the play that I think of, the play that always stands out when I think of Levens is the touchdown against the Panthers in the '96 NFC Championship game, where it was the same concept that we saw from the Favre game winner, is that two jet all go. It's a different alignment. I think it was Brown right or something, and Levens is lined up behind the tight end. He does that kind of up, and I think he went up against safety, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it kind of got in no man's land. Favre put it up, and Westbrook because I had in my mind he's basically like Brian Westbrook before Brian Westbrook. He goes up and essentially mosses the guy in the end zone and jams his heel down for his second foot to get down in the end zone. So yeah, I mean he's a great screen runner. You think of like guys running routes now. I think of like, Aaron Jones, who's doing it now, who was a wide receiver in high school, like certainly not at that level, but for a guy his size and of the era, like, yeah, he did enough to give you versatility in the run game and pass game there.
Absolutely. So definitely worthy of being on this list of nominees. Moving on to another one of our nominees, we've got Andre Rison. And I think, is this catch from the Super Bowl game, Mark?
Yeah, that's the catch in the first quarter when Favre audibled. he saw the blitz coming, he saw the pressure coming, and he audibled to this and put it up for Rison. And this was to me, we'll get to the Desmond Howard return, but this is one of the defining plays that I remember this touchdown catch more than I remember the Antonio Freeman caught an 80-yard touchdown pass in this game.
Sure.
But this was the catch that everybody remembers because of the way that Favre just totally beat the Patriots, caught him flat-footed. It was almost too easy.
Dropping it right into the bucket here. Andre Rison, definitely one of the greats. And speaking of Desmond Howard, it's funny because and we were talking about this. I remember a lot of Desmond Howard in the playoffs and certainly in the Super Bowl on the return for a touchdown, but he was much more than just a playoff returner, right? Like he was really an impact player for the Packers that year.
His hands were much better in the return game than they were as a receiver. He lost one fumble all season. He was brought into Green Bay on a 1 year, $300,000 show me contract. And he was the best kick returner in the NFL that year. He was the Packers' primary kickoff and punt returner, and he led the league in punt returning in dominant fashion. And it really cranked up in the playoffs. He was just, the Patriots, the week of the Super Bowl, they made no bones about the fact that they planned to kick to Howard. And in the Super Bowl, they did, and he returned his first punt. Tom Tupa, I think, booted the ball 50 yards, and Howard returned it over 30 yards down the Patriots sideline. It was just, he had several returns in that game of longer than 30 yards, including the kickoff return after the Patriots had closed down to 28-21 or 24-21. I can't remember exactly what it was, but this was at the end of the third quarter, and this was sort of the icing on the cake. It was just a devastating reply to sort of this careful New England comeback that had been building. And it was just, they stopped kicking to Howard after this. Not surprising.
A little bit too little too late, right?
That's exactly
I remember this game feeling exactly that. The Patriots are coming back. This game is not over. And then Desmond Howard just broke their backs with this return. I don't know, Dusty, if you have any insight on what happened on that particular return or anything you can recall from that play.
No, special teams. That's the thing. He never really recaptured that. He went, I think, Detroit after Green Bay, if I'm not mistaken.
Was it the Redskins, or did he get him drafted by the Redskins?
He was at Detroit at some point. I can't remember if that was the year after or a couple years after or something. I'm not overly familiar with the career, the post-Packers career of Desmond Howard. I'm sad to admit, but that's the thing. It was just a perfect combination. They had good blocking, they had a good special teams unit. And he was just quick and saw the holes, man. They never, to this day have not come close to getting close to what they did that year. But it was just, the blocking was good. They had a really good, very good disciplined special teams unit. And then Howard just, and that's the thing. He'd see one gap, he'd hit that sucker and he was gone. But if he had to make five guys miss, he was making five guys miss. He was in a zone. I think of this game. I think of that divisional round game, the Mud Bowl against the Niners, where he just, you couldn't do anything. It was just a pit of mud. And the way he tilted that game was just absolutely insane. So yeah, he was one of those things. I'd say I'd never seen anything like it. And then, Devin Hester came in the league, but he was that year was transcendent. And then, like you said, just amped it up in the playoffs.
I think the kicker on that kickoff was Vinatieri.
That is
number 4 there in the middle of the.
There he is.
And Vinatieri always contended that he was clipped on this return.
That looks like a face mask right there. So we're going to call it a watch. That looks like a face mask right there. So if he was clipped, then that was a face mask. But it's an interesting point that you made, Dusty. That to this day, the Packers have not replicated that special teams success, and I think it's been a big miss for some of the championship caliber teams that we've had. It's been special teams that have maybe bogged them down a little bit. So, hoping for better things this year. I know my draft crush, Amari Rodgers, is going to bring some of that heat. So, and I think you're pretty excited about him too, Dusty. If I read your Twitter,
over the moon about Amari Rodgers.
Awesome. All right. Well, moving on from Desmond Howard, we've got this picture of the White House, which, kind of has all of our GOAT nominees at some point assembled here.
See a Bears jersey in the background there.
That's an interesting story.
Bears jersey, because for whatever reason, the Bears trip to the White House have been called off. Like the Bears never went to the White House after they won the Super Bowl in '85. And so McMahon had clearance from Holmgren and Wolf to wear his Bears jersey for the ceremony. It's a subliminally ironic and endearing about McMahon, and just a fun factoid about the picture. But there's the saviors and the architects, they're all there of the Packers rebirth.
There's a lot of greatness in this picture, and an interesting fact about Jim McMahon and his Bears jersey. Something that I had never noticed before until you had pointed that out. So really cool story. I don't know. Maybe somebody Favre didn't get the memo about the jacket color for the day or something. He's standing out a little bit there, but definitely lots of GOATs in this picture. So maybe just before we get into our final selections of the greatest of this era, let's talk a little bit about Bob Harlan and the stamp that he put on the organization.
Well, I mean, if you want a hero of the second half of the Packers history, the first half I think has got to be Curly Lambeau. I think you can make an excellent case for Harlan. He's not a GOAT, but he was the consummate football executive. And by the time he ascended to the presidency in Green Bay, he'd been working for the organization for like 18 or 19 years, and in just about in every department and all sorts of things. He negotiated contracts. He was in PR. He was in all sorts of ways. He's a former baseball executive with the St. Louis Cardinals. He'd been the SID at Marquette when Al McGuire was their basketball coach. He learned under Al McGuire. It was just who told him, you never tell people anything they don't want to know. But he was the guy who finally went into the Packers executive board in 1991 and was told them what they didn't want to know, which was that they had to get rid of Tom Brands. They had to get rid of Lindy and Vaughn. But in 97, the Packers ranked 20th in the NFL, or they ranked 9th in the NFL out of 30 teams in revenue. But by 1998, that was trending in the wrong direction. The Packers, I think, made $20 million from Lambeau Field in 1998, where teams who just renovated their stadiums were making about $36 million from their stadiums. Lambeau Field was not a dump. It was a football palace, but it was only open essentially 10 days a year. And Harlan, they had a stock sale right around the Super Bowl, right around the victory in the first Super Bowl in '96, and their goal was to raise like $85 million, and I think they raised somewhere in the 20s or 30s, and which was good. But Harlan could see the writing on the wall that their share of revenue was going to go down. They got a lot of money from the TV contract that the NFL had, but the teams that were making a lot of money were teams that had their stadiums were working for them. The Redskins renovated. I think they went to move to FedEx Field and renovated that and made it a palace and jumped to the top of the NFL in revenue. And so Harlan had seen what the Orioles had done at Camden Yards, and he decided that was kind of like the model for the Packers, and he wanted to renovate Lambeau Field and make it sort of a vintage place. And he had great stories about the construction. He's like, less brick, more metal, more tubes, more, he was like, anything that could make it look old, I wanted to make it look old. But it was a controversial thing. Like there was, the city of Milwaukee had just been through a controversial, acrimonious deal over Miller Park the year before. They were in the dead of night. The state legislator reversed his vote on the financing for Miller Park, and they passed a sales tax in 5 counties. And the legislator was actually recalled. It was pretty unprecedented because of what he did with County State or Miller Park. And the Packers, the stadium was a hugely expensive boondoggle, and people in Brown County, where this tax was going to be, the sales tax was, they needed like $160 million from Brown County to help cover the costs. It was a very controversial thing, but they passed it by a 52-47 margin in 2000. I think soon after. I mean, there you can see the atrium on the left side of the picture. They turned Lambeau into a year-round destination. It's booked through the end of this year, and it was back when I was writing the book. It's a place where you can go all year round, and people do. I mean, they eat lunch in the restaurant, they go to the gift shop, they go to the Hall of Fame, they shop in the atrium, they take the tour. So and now it's got conference rooms. They built a 5-star hotel or a 5-diamond hotel next to it, a Kohler property, but the Kohler Hotel has no meeting rooms. All the meeting rooms are in Lambeau Field. And so it's a joint operation, but that's all Bob Harlan's doing. And the Packers are now solidly in the middle of the NFL in revenue, despite playing in a market that is by far, not just the smallest in the NFL, but in professional sports in North America. The Packers are in like the middle of the road in revenue, which is a huge victory. They're one of the most valuable franchises in sports, and that's because Bob Harlan got that deal made. And the Brewers in March of 2020 finally sunset their sales tax. After more than 20 years, would have been 96 is when they passed it. They finally sunset the sales tax. The Packers were done with sunsetting their sales tax in 10 years. and they're so financially viable now that they had another stock sale, but they renovated Lambeau Field again in 2011, and they paid for it all themselves. So it's a testament to Bob Harlan and what the stewardship of the organization. And I really you can make a case for him for the Green Bay Mount Rushmore. I don't think he goes up there, but there's a reason that the Packers are the financial colossus they are today, and it's that man in this building right there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's interesting because he is, like you said, kind of that savior of the second half of the Packers era. In a history where the town was always having to come and save the team. It was Bob Harlan that kind of solidified all of those efforts.
He'd be a giant in their legacy. If his only thing he'd done was hire Ron Wolf.
Sure.
But I mean, this Lambeau thing is it's just. I mean, there's I think the architectural review of the stadium is not that great. I think there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no it's a hodgepodge. It's a mishmash. But it is exactly what Harlan's vision was, and I mean, right down to the amount of money they make off it. It's transformed that team in all sorts of ways, and you can see it on the field and in the crowd.
Yeah, can't argue with that. And this is kind of an interesting journey that we've taken, all the way from City Park, all the way, City Stadium, all the way through the newly renovated Lambeau Field. And I think maybe in our next episode, we'll touch on some of that renovation stuff too, and part of that era. So it's come time, guys. What's that?
I've got more to say. Yeah.
Oh, I know you do, Mark. I know you do. And unfortunately, our journey here is coming to an end because our next week's episode is going to be our last episode, which has touching on the Ted Thompson era, and then maybe planting some seeds in terms of the Gutekunst era and what we feel is going to come next. But now's the moment of truth. We've got to pick our GOATs for the Ron Wolf era, which is no easy task with the amount of talent and great players that was there. But I think we've settled on a few. Do we want to just do the reveal? Do we want to talk about it a little bit? What do you guys think?
How much time do we have?
Well, hey, we're already at an hour and 38 minutes, and there's still 5 people with us here. So
let's reveal it.
All right, sounds good. So, I mean, I don't think you can argue with any of these picks if you're anybody worth their salt. Certainly, could be an argument made for some other folks to be included here, but we settled on obviously Ron Wolf, the era in which we've named after him. Brett Favre, got to start with him. Number 4, Reggie White, Sterling Sharp, and Leroy Butler. Those are our GOATs from the from the Ron Wolf era. You know, Dusty, you got any issues with this list? Anybody you think we left off here?
No, I mean, and I think, Sharp needs to be on there for sure. I think, if there was a guy to cut, I think it'd be him, but only because of kind of a shortened career. But yeah, no, I mean, listen, you look at this and like you said, you're missing about 5 guys you could be putting on here, but that's a solid 5 right there, man.
Yeah. And, we talked about Sharp and there was just no way I could leave him off, when you're looking at his greatness and small of a sample size as it may be, again, I don't know that I've watched a player that was just from a talent and on the field dominance perspective on the offensive side anyways, better than him. And to me, that puts him on the list. I think we've got a really good list here. Antonio Freeman, Andre Rison, Dorsey Levens. There's guys that are near and dear to my heart here, but I think this is our Mount Rushmore for the 90s. So, make sure you guys join us next week because we are going to be going through the Ted Thompson era. Again, make sure you go out and get Mark's book, The People's Team and Illustrated History of the Green Bay Packers. I've got the link up there. I've got my copy right here. Great read. Great talking to you guys. Really appreciate you guys jumping on. And again, make sure you jump on for next week. If you haven't followed us on YouTube already, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. There is actually some really, really big, fun things coming for Game as we hit season 2 of Game on Wisconsin. So make sure you're coming along for the ride. Got lots more great stuff for you. But for Mark and Dusty, I'm Ryan. Go Pack Go.